Good afternoon.
Great, America.
Welcome to the March meeting of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. My name is Jonathan Stair and I'm the president. I do want to alert you ahead of time, if you're here for the draft records presentation, that was switched with next month's presentation because our speaker, Tyler Stump, had a family engagement that he later found out about. And so he and I decided to switch our presentations to make things simple rather than trying to schedule another meeting. So if you want to learn about Civil War draft records, come next month, and I apologize for that confusion. Is there anybody here for the first time, never been with us before? Okay, I'd like you to tell us your name, where you're from, and what families you're interested in.
My name is Bob Bowen, raised in Lancaster, live in York now. I'm interested in both.
Okay.
Hi, Eric Webb. I'm Glen Rock. Trying to figure out who picked Webb on.
Okay. Somebody else, I see another hand back here. Yes.
I'm William Stambaugh. I'm from New York, and I'm just interested in the subject.
Okay, good. At this time, I'm going to ask our secretary, Richard Robinson, to read the minutes from last month's meeting. Did I say Robinson? I'm sorry, Robinstein.
Okay. The last board meeting, Jonathan introduced the fifth. There was no new attendance at that time. Program minutes were read by myself. All program notes are printed and filed, as well as they're on Google Drive. Margaret read the treasury report, which is also logged on and filed into the system. As of January 23rd, January 31st, the final balance was $15,811.50. Membership is 134, of which 2 renewals, 1 formal member, and the other renewing for 2 years. Nicole announced upcoming events and activities for the History Center and advised that this meeting was being televised on Zoom, or I'm sorry, on YouTube. You can see through that. Jonathan mentioned a couple of upcoming events, and Richard Kunkel went over the upcoming events for the rest of the remainder of the year. As I said, all notes are finalized and filed on paper as well as in Barth.
Okay, the treasurer's report for February. The balance at January 31st, 2023 was $15,811.50. Receipts for February publication sales, $323. A donation of $50. Total receipts of $373. Disbursements, the speaker fee for Rodney Barnett was $125. Postal connections for the January-February newsletter, $131.58. Total disbursements, $256.58. The cash balance as of February 28th, $15,927.92. The membership stands at 134.
Thank you. Nicole?
Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Smith at the History Center. Just a couple of announcements before we get move on to the program. This program is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. And it's also being streamed on Zoom and Facebook as we speak. Couple of upcoming programs. Our second Saturday speaker is Tom Davidson. He'll be speaking on Malin Haynes and the Shoe House. We also have our York Civil War Roundtable program, which is March 15th. The speaker is Randy Dreas, and speaking about women at Gettysburg. On March 25th, we have a program called Historic Preservation in Your Community with Mindy Crawford of Preservation, Pennsylvania. And on April 18th, our Distinguished Speaker Series will host Eric Larson, the author, at the Appel Center. So please check that out. Thank you very much. Please visit yorkhistorycenter.org for information on all of our programs.
Thank you, Nicole. I have a number of items that I want to mention this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank all those who helped with the genealogy seminar last Saturday. That includes Becky and Lynn, Richard Kunkel, Erica, and Nicole. And I also want to thank Margaret, who went out of her way, even though she had multiple crises Saturday morning, went out of her way to check on us to make sure everything was going okay. So thank you to all of you. I thought the program was very successful. And I think the History Center is interested in maybe doing that again, so we'll see. The board has approved revisions to our bylaws, and those the revised version of the bylaws should be on the website by now. There are paper copies in the back. If you're a member and you want to see what the changes are, you can take a look at that. If you would like to have a copy in hand to take home to study, and I run out of paper copies, I'll be glad to mail that to you. Next month in April, we will be proposing our slate of nominations for officers of the upcoming year. And I'm going to mention those names now, but the official nomination will be next month. Margaret will resume as treasurer. Richard Robinstein will resume as recording secretary. Becky Anstein as corresponding secretary, and Mindy Sowers as director at large. However, we will be glad to accept nominations of other members who might want to serve as officers. And if you want to be president, I would be glad to advocate my position and let you become president, and I will do something else. So also, we are still looking for a director of public relations. We really like to have somebody who's good with social media to take that position. That's not me. I don't know a log from a blog or a tweet from a bird song, so I'm not the person to have that. Couple updates on some things. Hopefully on Tuesday, Richard, myself, and Lynn will have a Zoom meeting with representatives of FamilySearch.org to talk about scanning the oldest records of Christ Lutheran Church. About 2 weeks ago, I had a very pleasant visit with the records keepers of York City, and I'm pleased to report that many more records survived than what I had anticipated. And so if you're doing research in York City, trust me, there's a lot of good resources available. You just have to know who to contact and then get hold of them. I did prepare a little guide to some of the resources which will be available here in the History Center, also at the York County Archives. I'm hoping to work with the city. We're still in negotiations, work with the city to get a grant inventory and arrange what they have. And so at some point in the future, we might need volunteers for that. This week, we started offering a genealogy class down at the South Central York County Senior Center in New Freedom. So that's moving ahead, and there's a lot of good interest in that program. So not only are we having programs here, but down there, and they would like us to do more things down there. If you've always wanted to get your hands dirty in the dirt, starting on May the 8th through June the 20th, the Friends of Camp Security will be sponsoring another archaeological dig out the site of Camp Security, and they are looking for volunteers to help with digging. It does require some physical capabilities, which I'm rapidly losing. So, but if you want to see what archaeology is all about and how it works, see me or go to the website for the Friends of Camp Security, and you can sign up there. Some of you who are on genealogy sites or subscribe to genealogical periodicals may have seen the notice about the increase in fees by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And Lynn Nelson shared this with the board. I don't know, Lynn, if you want to say anything more about what's going on there.
Not really. There's a lot of details, but basically they want to raise rates. And the genealogical community is doing things to try to put in.
This would be fees that you have to pay to get copies of naturalization records from the federal government. And one website that I read said that the fee increase is going to be, I think, 270%, if I remember correctly. So it's more than double what the fee is now. And if you do anything like that right now, I think the fees.
The website is Reclaim the Records. To find information.
Okay,
You might want to say it because people can hear me back here.
the website, which website?
For information, the website is Reclaim the Records.
The indexes.
No, just
No.
reclaim.
Reclaim the Records.
The name of the website.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, name of the website.
Okay, the name of the website is Reclaim the Records. Okay,
They
okay.
have information and where you can write to your.
Or if you just Google USCIS fee increase, I think it will probably take you to some pertinent websites. At our board meeting, we're going to decide whether or not we want to support opposition to the fee increase. I think that most of us would be on board with that. That we don't want to see more fees being charged, particularly for those historical records.
Those records by law should be at the National Archives by now, but they're not.
Okay,
And they're free at the National Archives if they were there.
so that's something. And if you would like to write something as a person to our senators or representatives, feel free to do so, because that will be in addition to anything that we do as an organization. Okay, at this time, I'm going to have our Vice President Richard Kunkel come and tell us about future programs and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have several more programs here for this year, which ends June 30th. So if some of you came today wanting to hear about draft records, we did a little swap to help out our speaker for today, who had a family event that came up. So we're lucky that the two speakers for March and April could switch. So next month is Jonathan Stair about draft records, Civil War draft records particularly. So that's the April meeting. Then on May, I believe it's the 7th, we will be off-site. We will be at St. Luke's Cemetery in New Bridgeville in Chancery Township. That congregation is, originally it was a Union church, but Lutheran and German Reformed. It's now just a Lutheran church celebrating its 250th anniversary. And former librarian and archivist here, she's Emeritus June Lloyd. She's one of the presenters for that, as well as Gene Robinson, who is a member of that congregation. So that should be a very interesting presentation. Please come out if you're able to. It's always nice when we have the off-site events. And then our final program for the season actually has to do with camp security. It's John Palmer, who is the main archaeologist who has been discovering things. Of course, recently they believe they've actually found the site by the post holes and so forth. So I think there's some interesting information that we can get from that about a Revolutionary War British prisoner of war camp. It was an American camp, but with British prisoners of war. Some of those, I guess, were Hessians as well. So no Hessians. That's just an old myth.
That's a myth, yeah.
A myth. All right. Well, and Jonathan knows a whole lot about that more than I do. Just if any of you have ideas for programs for next year, I will be doing that over the summer. With the move of the History Center, we're probably good for having programs here through the end of this calendar year. The early part of 2024, we're probably going to have to be off-site somewhere. So we may travel around a bit, visit some hopefully interesting locations. Some places maybe we've been before, maybe some new places. Our speaker today is Tyler Stump. He is an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg. He's also a native here of York County, has deep York County roots, and I twisted his arm and he says he's going to join our society. So he spoke to us before about Pennsylvania state hospital records, lunatic asylums, state mental hospitals. That was quite interesting. Those records are at the state archives. Today, he's going to talk to us about state prison records, which go way far back and can be very interesting. So I look forward to that. I was saying before the meeting started, back in the 70s and 80s, you always heard people say, oh, don't do your family history, it'll go back and you'll find a horse thief. Well, this sort of is along that line, but you know, you might find something else that's interesting. And actually in my own research, I did find someone, it wasn't a horse thief, he broke into stores after it's dark in the early 1800s. Burgled things, so those records show those sorts of things. So please welcome Tyler Stone.
Thank you, Richard. Everybody hear me okay? Good. All right. Very happy to be here to see you all again. I recommend a lot of faith here, which is good. And I know Jonathan was scheduled to go on, so I'm sure some of you are disappointed. I'm not as handsome or eloquent as he is, but I'll try and keep you occupied for the rest of our time here. So there we go. I'm going to start off with this picture. So I want to spend today talking about the prison records that we have at the state archives and how you can use them in your genealogical research to learn more about family members who were incarcerated in Pennsylvania in the past. But I also wanted to use this time to share with you some exciting new acquisitions that we've gotten at the state archives in recent years. My main job, I'm not really a prison record expert by any means, but I'm an acquisitions archivist at the archives, which means it's my job to travel around the state and collect records with historical value and bring them back to the state archives in Harrisburg, which brings us this photograph here. This is a collection of prison inmate cards that we got from State Correctional Institution at Rockville, which is up in Center County near State College. And we got, I think, about 25 boxes of cards like these that were just stored basically in like the attic section above one of the cell blocks. For a very long time, just kind of thrown in these boxes. So as soon as we saw them, I was very excited. Of course, this has historical value. We've got to bring these back to Harrisburg, and we did. There were about 20,000 or so of these cards dated from the 20s up through the 70s or so. The only problem is that they were all just thrown in boxes like this. I'm sure at one point they were in, you know, a file or a drawer system, and I think they just dumped them in the boxes and put them in storage when they went over to like a digital inmate system or something like that. So they're really interesting, but all out of order. So I spent several months putting them all back in order. So I'm very good at the alphabet now. But so I really got to look at a lot of these records up close and personal, which was really exciting, and just seeing the genealogical information that was in them, which is really exciting. And I want to show this one. This is one of my own ancestors who was a surprise to find. And he was someone who was arrested for burglary in the 60s. He's from Red Line originally, although he was living in York at the time, actually just like a mile from where we're standing right now. And so it was just a real big surprise to find him. I found one other family member also as I was going through these. So I had two family members who were incarcerated at the same prison at different points in the 20th century. And so that just really made me think a lot about just my own family and just other families and the unexpected things you might find in prison records. And not just learning about their sentence, but learning a little bit about who these people are, you know, as individuals. This person's a very distant cousin, so I didn't know him or anything. But on the side here, it has a list of marks and scars that the inmate has. So on one arm, he has tattoos of the names Julie, Allie, and Toots. And then on the other side, you have Norma and Gladys. So very popular guy. Just, you know, stories like that. It also says that he escaped from the prison. There was a foggy day and he climbed the perimeter fence and got out and was apprehended by state police about a week later, which increased his sentence there from two, I think it was just a few years. It added 10 more years onto his sentence. So just a lot of little details like that that you're not going to find, you know, in a census record, a birth or death record, those sorts of things. So just there's a lot of possibility, a lot of potential in prison records to learn a lot more about our family in ways that we might not find in other places. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Pennsylvania State Archives. I know Jonathan talks about it a lot because he worked there for a very long time. We're located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We have been there since 1903. I've got our website up here on the front. And so we are kind of your one-stop shop for anything related to Pennsylvania as a state as a whole. We're going to be a good spot to do research there. The mission of the Pennsylvania State Archives is to acquire, preserve, and make available for study the permanently valuable public records of the Commonwealth, with particular attention given to the records of state government. I just want to go over that as a kind of a caveat to everything I'm talking about. When we have family members who were incarcerated and were in prisons in the past, the people that you'll find at the state archives are ones who were in state prisons, and that is just one portion of the prison system that existed or has existed in Pennsylvania There's a lot more of people who were in county jails, who were in federal prisons. So you're not going to find that with us. There are other places that are going to have that information. I'll touch on that a little bit. But really, if you have, you're going through family records or anything and you see references to state prisons, then the state archive is really going to be the place to go. And we're going to have hopefully at least some sort of information we can learn a little bit more about them. So what are we going to talk about today? There's really three things that I want to kind of focus and make sure when we're finished today, you're walking away with something to remember a little bit about this. One, what can I find at the Pennsylvania State Archive? So what are the types of information? What are the institutions that we have, like the prison institutions that we do have records from? Two, what information can I find in them? So like, what's the actual stuff that's on the page or on the document or in the photograph that I can learn about my ancestor? And then three, the most important thing, how do I access these records? So once I've got you all hooked on prison records and you really want to go find them, how do you go get to them? How do you look at them? So that's what's on the agenda today. So the state prison system in Pennsylvania is very large and very old. I think that's just kind of one of the things that comes with Pennsylvania being an old and large state. The first state prison was opened in Philadelphia in 1790. So it's been a very long time that the state of Pennsylvania has been operating penitentiaries or penal facilities in Pennsylvania. And I think that's good. And also just a lot of the prisons in Pennsylvania are, I don't really know the best way to say it, but they're very like historically significant. I know Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, the very famous prison. I'm sure a lot of us have heard of it, maybe even visited. It's a historic site now that you can go and walk around. And I think that's good for genealogists. That means that these prisons, because people understood the historic value of them as an institution, they were saving more records that you might not get from other places. And I know other states, the historical record that remains from their prisons is not as voluminous as you'll see in Pennsylvania. So for whatever reasons, things got saved because people thought they were important, and that has really paid off for a lot of us. Today, when we're doing genealogical work, there's a lot of records, sometimes too many, and you've got to sift through everything to find what you're looking for. But by and large, if you have an ancestor who was incarcerated in a state prison, the record exists somewhere. So I feel pretty confident that you'll be able to find something somewhere. This is a map of all the state prisons that have been operated in Pennsylvania. So as you can see, there's quite a few. The majority of these were ones that were open, I'd say, in the last 40 years or so. And that's conversation for another day, but just the prison system in the state has really expanded in the last generation or so. But just to show you that there are state prisons all across the state. And people that we may have in our families, our ancestors, or other folks that we're trying to research, in theory, they could have been incarcerated in really any of these prisons, depending on, when the crime was committed, where the crime was committed. But just because you live in York County or Adams County doesn't mean they're necessarily going to send you to the closest prison to you. You could have gone anywhere. And I found folks from this area in all the prisons listed here on this map. So, just if you're doing these kinds of searches, don't be surprised if you're looking at a prison over in Pittsburgh or something, that it comes up. That's just kind of part of the territory of doing research in prisons. I have up here on the screen just the prisons that the state archives has the largest collections for, and this is just the most records and the most different kinds of records. So if you're going through your research and you find references to the ones I have up on the screen, Eastern and Western state penitentiaries, those are the ones that are really the oldest state prisons in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the Allegheny County Workhouse, and then state prisons in Huntingdon, Rockview, which is Center County, Graterford, which is Montgomery County over by Philly, and Camp Hill up in Cumberland County. If you see these names, then you're definitely in luck because we have tons of stuff from these records. And I'm sure Jonathan has, assisted probably thousands of people doing research, probably mostly in these prisons over the course of his career. So these are the ones that we're definitely going to find folks for if you're doing research at the state archives. Not always, but typically folks from South Central Pennsylvania are going to show up. Of the ones that we have big collections for, Eastern State Penitentiary, that was kind of like the largest and oldest one in the state, and we have the most from them, but also prisons at Huntingdon, Rockview, and Camp Hill. So again, if you see these names, you just in any family records or anything like that, or just something like that, you're going to be in luck when you're at the state archives. I have up here on the screen, this is the county reception register from Eastern State Penitentiary from 1893. We've got here, just to give you a sense of, we've got folks from every different county a lot of times in these prisons. So in 1893, it looks like there were 13 people from Eastern State Penitentiary, and then it kind of goes down, and there are people from every state, or every county in the state rather. And then we'll scroll all the way down, and then we've got York here at the bottom. There were 52 people from York that year, out of a total of 1,700. So not a ton of people, but again, they're going to show up here and you're going to find them. And this is a prison that's all the way over in Philadelphia. So, that's kind of a hike from here. So just to give you kind of a sense of what we're looking at. In general, the state prison system was a lot smaller in the in the 1800s and early 1900s compared to today, where I don't know what the numbers are today, but it's thousands and thousands of people who are incarcerated currently. So there's not a ton of people, but there is still quite a few from the South Central PA region. So the three main types, or at least from my perspective, looking at stuff in the state archives, there's kind of three categories of records that you'll find at the state archives from different state prisons. The first is inmate records. The second one is kind of administrative records that are created in the course of administering or operating a prison. And then the third one, I don't have a great name for it, I just call it everything else, the other category. But we'll kind of break this down a little bit and talk about what types of records these are to give you a sense of when you're doing your research, what kind of things are you actually going to look at. The first one is inmate records, and as genealogists, this is probably what we're the most interested in and what we'll kind of start our search with. And this can include things like admission and discharge books, descriptive registers, which will be kind of entries on individual inmates, and it might give you a little bit more information than just kind of the initial admission thing. Inmate files, escape files, statistical books. It seems like every prison has a different name for a lot of these records. You might see something like convict reception register, or you might see Bertillon handbook or things like that. So if you're looking at the state archives catalog or something like that, I would definitely recommend reading the description of the records to see like what actually is this, because the name might not tell you exactly what this sort of record is. But these are things that are going to tell you about individual inmates, who they are, that sort of thing. I've got up here on the screen, we have a lot of stuff digitized from Eastern State Penitentiary, so that's a lot of my examples. But this is an Eastern State Pen. It says a discharge description docket, so it's just a big ledger where they're just writing on each line. It's an early version of a spreadsheet, I guess, but just listing each individual inmate as they were discharged or released from the prison. So we've got a lot of information, their inmate number, their name, what their age was at the time of their discharge, what their crime was, what county they're from, and then it gives additional information from there. And then this is the other side, the other page of that. It lists the nature of their discharge. So were they released as they finished their sentence? Was their sentence commuted? Were they pardoned? In some rare exceptions, were they executed by the state? Things like that. It has more information here. Did they work any jobs when they were in the prison? So we've got a lot of folks here who, one guy was working canning. Other folks were doing other folks like that. It says if they received any education while they were incarcerated. So you have a few people in this column. It says they were taught reading and writing. So that's kind of an interesting thing. This one actually has a column for what their weight was at the time of discharge, which I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Their intended residence after they left the prison, which again can be a really good thing for genealogists. Where did they go after they were in the prison? And then a list of remarks. In this, the remarks column on the side, it says how much money they had when they left the prison. So again, it can be interesting stuff that you might not find in any other genealogical records that might just tell you a little bit more about these people, who they were, or just something you didn't find anywhere else. Administrative records. So these are going to be really anything that the prison was generating in the course of just operating a prison. So you're going to find a lot of different kinds of reports, board of trustees, minutes, and those sorts of things, construction or building files, prison program records. So that could be educational, recreational programs, work programs, that sort of things, employee files, warden journals, financial documents. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm interested in genealogy. I'm looking for my ancestor. I don't really care about the annual report from the prison they were at. And I would really say this is something maybe not to look at first, but it's definitely something to keep in mind A lot of times when we look at inmate records, they're just going to tell us kind of a bare minimum. It's just basic information about that inmate. What was their name? Where were they from? What was their crime? How long were they at the prison? If you really want to learn about the experience of being at a prison, these are really the records that are going to teach you that. So we might know that our ancestor was at, Western State Penitentiary from 1872 to 1875. And if we look at the reports and other documents, that'll tell us what's going on at the prison during that time. What's the everyday experience like? What's the food that's available? Did anything unusual happen during that time? So it really it fills in the skeleton that you're going to find with their basic genealogical information in inmate records. So this is definitely something, maybe not something to start with when you're doing your research, but definitely keep it in mind to kind of add a little bit more color to your family search when you're doing that in prison records. I have here up on the screen a warden's journal from a prison in Graterford, which is Montgomery County. And it was literally just the warden every day. He just wrote down kind of what happened in the prison. So he says, did anybody enter the prison? Was anyone discharged? Did anyone get a misconduct record? Was anybody in the infirmary? Were there any injuries or sicknesses or anything like that? Did anything unusual happen? And actually, if we scroll down a little bit, there's a line here. It says, no unusual occurrences to report. The population, they were all keyed up and ready to listen to a boxing match that was going to be on the radio that day. Some were even foolish enough to bet on it. So again, that's just, you're not going to find that in an inmate file. But again, the fact that your ancestor might have been in the prison in 1954 and boxing was something that they could listen to on the radio. Like that's just, I think, a neat thing that just kind of gives you a little more interesting window into the life and the experience of being in a prison at the time. I have here, this one's a little blurry, but this is another warden's journal from that same prison. And it has a misconduct listed on here, and it says a minor misconduct, larceny of Frankfurter. So an inmate still again, and it actually lists the inmate number for that. So in theory, we could go to the inmate records and see who that was. So again, these are the kinds of things that happen in prisons, which get documented. It can be all the way from like major prison riots or escapes, all the way down to these little ordinary day-to-day things. I think there's really the fact that these prisons documented so many different kinds of things is really special and unique for us as a genealogical resource. You can really just learn a lot of things, but it just might not be what we're expecting to learn. But there's, like I said, a lot of potential here. And then that last category I talked about, other records, everything else that doesn't really fit in inmate or administrative stuff. And that's going to be really, it's different from prison to prison, whatever sort of things got saved, but you'll find photographs, newsletters, which sometimes are written by inmates or sometimes are written by staff, special event records, sometimes like staff handbooks or things. So instructions of like, you were an inmate at this prison, here are the rules and that sort of thing. Publicity files, so sometimes if there are unusual events, sometimes the prison will save newspaper clippings from it. Sometimes they will save kind of like other things from it. It's really hard to tell you what these things are. It's just, there's a little bit of everything. And what I've got on the screen are a couple of inmate newsletters from Western State Penitentiary from the 40s. And they wrote about just about anything you can imagine. They almost look like reading book reports where somebody would be like, I read this book from the library and let me tell you what I was thinking about. Or other people talked about the nature of incarceration at a philosophical level in a prison. Like you would never expect that. But just again, all sorts of things. You can just learn a lot about what are people doing, what are people thinking about in the prison, what's life like. So once you find your ancestor in an inmate record, that's really something where I'd encourage you to talk with the archivist at the archives, and we can help you learn the rest of the story, or at least the rest of it that's going to be in the documents. And that all being said, I did want to talk a little bit about what the State Archives does not have. So you want to temper your expectations. We have a lot, but not everything. We don't have a lot of records that were written or produced by inmates themselves. We have some small collections of letters and things of that nature that inmates might have written. But again, it's not thorough, it's not really voluminous. So what you're really going to find is what the prison is saying about these inmates. So that's a very different perspective. And so I know a lot of times families will say, well, this is the story that was passed down in my family from my ancestors at the prison. And that may conflict with what's in the official record. And that's not to say what our ancestors said wasn't true. It's just it might not show up in the official government record of things. So that's something to keep in mind. Court records really isn't something that we have in the state archives. That's going to be something where you would want to reach out to, the county where the crime was committed, in theory, by our ancestor, typically in the clerk of court's office or the prothonotary, just because those are county level records. That's not something that would be generated or held at the state level. Newspapers is typically something we don't have at the state archives because those are published records. So, newspapers.com, going to the Pennsylvania State Library, the York County History Center. That's really a better place to look for these sorts of things. So that's just something if you're interested in that. Newspaper records are a great resource for learning about our family members, and sometimes that's our first record we find and say, oh, I have an ancestor who was arrested. Now we know I should look in the prison records. That's just not something you'll find at the state archives. We don't really have a lot of records created by family members or legal representation, so their lawyer basically. Sometimes, but again, that's the stuff from that perspective isn't something that's kept by the state archives. We don't really have records from federal, county, or local prisons. So again, that's something, reach out to your local historical society. They're going to be a better bet to find that stuff, just because if it's not a state level thing, it's not something we are obligated to collect. We sometimes have it, but it's uncommon. And then we have few inmate records from, I would say, about 1980 or later. Those records are still kind of active or semi-active. So really, if you want to contact the State Department of Corrections, they can usually find these records for you. And I've had a lot of success having genealogists contact them, and they still have the records kind of in their file area, I guess. I'm not sure what they call it. So you can always reach out to us, but we might direct you to somebody else if you're looking for any of the things on this list. That all being said, like I said, really, I would encourage you. State Archives is one part of the story, but if you're looking for folks who might have been arrested for some minor crime and were at the county jail for a little while, that's not going to be with us. It's going to be at the county level. There are always exceptions, of course. One of the collections that's really neat at the State Archives is from Eastern State Penitentiary. One of the staff people kept a scrapbook of just any newspaper clippings from people in Eastern State Penitentiary who were in the news. And so I have just a little piece of one of those articles. There was a group, they were called the New Freedom Gang, and it was a gang of burglars who tried to knock off the train station over down near Shrewsbury, and they failed because they didn't bring enough dynamite to pull the safe door open. So they were very quickly apprehended. But these are their pictures. I like they're all wearing their bowler hats in it. But the article basically just said they were terrible criminals. They're awful burglars, and they should be ashamed of themselves. But it has up here on the side, it lists all their inmate numbers. And remember, if we went back to that prison discharge record, that thing we were looking at, it lists everybody's inmate number. So again, a lot of these different types of records kind of speak to each other, or they cross-reference things. If you find a number or a name in one place, it's going to be listed somewhere else. So you kind of have to hop from one record to the next to get the full story. But again, some fun stuff that you'll find all over the place. So from here on out, so we've kind of talked about the general types of records and what information they have. I thought I would just go through some of the prisons that we have the largest collections from. We'll just kind of look at them as a whole and just maybe kind of help you remember these are the prisons that I want to go to the state archives to research. But I mentioned before, I'm an acquisitions archivist, so I bring things into the archives for us to research. So I thought I would just show you some things that we've collected in the last, say, 4 or 5 years or so. Some of these are brand new, so they're actually new acquisitions, not open to the public yet because we haven't finished working on them to get them ready for research. So you guys will be some of the first to see some of these things. Eastern State Penitentiary, probably the most famous or well-known prison in the state. It's in Philadelphia, opened in the 1820s and closed in the 1970s. You can still go there and visit it today. It's a really neat place. They have a great historical site group that works there who knows all about the prison. But we have the original records here in Harrisburg. Mostly that's going to have residents who are from the eastern half of the state, especially from the 1800s. Not always, but that's kind of primarily the inmate group. So a lot of people from South Central Pennsylvania are going to be there. One thing we found recently was a 20-page typed escape poem that an inmate wrote from the 1940s, or I think he wrote it in the 1950s, but it's from an escape attempt in the 1940s. Which included the famous gangster Willie Sutton, who was kind of a contemporary of like Al Capone and those other guys in the 20s. But they dug a tunnel under the prison wall and tried to escape. And I think there were 12 of them in total. 6 of them were caught immediately. The other 6 got away for a little while. They were all caught eventually. And one of them wrote a poem about the whole thing, about the digging the tunnel and escaping and being on the run. It's very interesting. It's not a great, well-written poem, but it's something, again, it's like, who would think that we're going to have poetry in a prison collection? But again, it tells us a little bit more about the life and the experience being in a prison. This one talked a lot about when they were recaught, what the like with the prison guards interrogating them and asking them like, who helped you dig this tunnel and that sort of thing. Again, inmates probably knew about this stuff, but it's not always going to show up in their inmate record. So it just kind of fleshes out everything. This is something that came to the archives very, very recently. 2 boxes that kind of just showed up on our doorstep from Eastern State Penitentiary. I haven't gone through it all yet, but they look like financial and administrative papers from Eastern State Pen from the 1820s through 60s. And these, I still haven't untied them yet, but they are very neat old documents, beautiful handwriting. So these again talk about things that the prison was purchasing. So we're going to say, if we want to know what was it like being in a prison, well, this is tell us what food they were buying for the inmates. We'll know what was dinner like every day, or they're going to say, what was available to them. What are the sorts of things that the prison is buying? So now we know what's in the prison. So I don't know exactly what's in these yet, but I will be very carefully untying them, unfolding them. So in the future, we'll have that. That's an exciting new acquisition, but this also helps prove that we don't just bring in new stuff, but there's still old prison records floating around in the state. So if you've been to the state archives in the past to do research, it always helps to come again because we're always getting new and exciting things. The next prison, probably a little less famous than Eastern, but just as old and just as big as Western State Penitentiary. And really for most of the 1800s and early 1900s, these are the 2 prisons in the state. Mostly people from the eastern half of the state go to Eastern, Western half go to Western. It's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, opened originally in 1826, closed in 2017, so not too long ago. Mostly folks from western part of the state, but not always. It was later known as the State Correctional Institution at Pittsburgh, so you might see different names, but it's the same place. Up here on the screen is a little excerpt from, didn't really have a name, but it was like a admission photo book, I guess. So every time somebody came in, they took their mugshot and then they put them in this book. And if you look at the guy on the bottom right, got like a really big nose. And I'm not sure what sort of conditioning he had or something, but it was very unusual. I looked up his inmate record, and actually it said that when he was incarcerated, the prison surgeon did an operation on his nose, basically like an early form of plastic surgery. And there is another picture with, you can see some of the scarring, but so that's just something, again, like that's his experience in the prison with kind of the infirmary. But yeah, like, who would have thought we'd find something like that? But a really interesting thing. And I won't say we have photographs of everybody from every prison, but we have a pretty large chunk of our inmate records that do have photographs when we start in like maybe the 1890s or so and going forward, when photography becomes a much more common and affordable thing, that all the inmates are being photographed. So something else that's pretty interesting. Next prison we'll talk about a little bit is, now it's called the State Correctional Institution at Huntingdon, which is just a little bit over west from here, opened in 1889. Originally, it was called the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory, and it was the place where juvenile offendees were sent in the state. So people under the age of 18. Today it's a regular prison who has a regular inmate population, but historically this is where, if you have any ancestors who are children, basically this is where they're going to go. And so you'll find a lot of people, no matter where in the state they lived or where the crime was committed, they're going to go to Huntingdon. This is an admission file from one person who was there. I don't remember where he was from. His name is Roy Blakesley. And basically he and a couple of friends, they knocked off some stores in town. They brought a bunch of revolvers and went around trying to rob some places. And I didn't get a great enough copy of this. Basically, if there's a description of the crime here, and this is from his admission file. And the warden is basically saying this was like a Wild West kind of robbery, except they lacked the brains and brawn of a Wild West robber. So he was not super impressed with them. So not everybody in the prison is big and bad. There's a lot of ordinary folks too. who for whatever reason committed a crime, but they're ordinary folks as well. And these records actually came, this is a picture of when they came to us, so with original government red tape wrapping around them. But yeah, these are from the late 1800s, early 1900s, so those have all been opened up and ready for research, but I thought it was neat to see what they look like when they come into the archives before we put them in nice neat folders and boxes. The next one is the State Correctional Institution at Rockview. So that's what we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation with all those inmate card files where I found my own ancestors. This is in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, up in Center County. It was opened in 1915, originally as kind of like an overflow institution for Western State Penitentiary, which was full. And later it became kind of like the prison farm for the state. So basically, able-bodied inmates who were what they call lesser risk, they're going to be transferred there from their original prison to work on the prison farm. And so you'll get folks who are all over the state, originally at Eastern and Western State Penitentiary, which are these older prisons, which just can't handle a larger volume of inmates as the population of the state grows. And it was also sometimes it's actually referred to as Western State Penitentiary Rockview. So if you see this reference in any family records or anything, sometimes the names are different, but you know, this is the institution. Aside from all those inmate files we got, they had a lot of really interesting escape files. These are two different ones, but one is an escape poster. The other one is a letter written to the governor of Louisiana trying to extradite somebody who escaped from Rockview and made it all the way down there. So basically they're saying our detectives found this guy in Louisiana. We're 100% certain that this is the guy who escaped. We need to bring him back up to PA to finish his sentence. And we actually had people who went as far as they made it back to Europe, basically. They were trying to hide out with family who were kind of their mother countries. So a lot of really interesting stuff. If you have an inmate who escaped, sometimes you'll find a little bit more about them too. And I don't have any scans here, but we actually found a few letters from family members who would write to the state that don't tell my family I'm writing this letter. But like Uncle so-and-so is hiding out here in the farm and come and get him because we know what he did. So, so really interesting stuff there. Next present we'll talk about real quick is the State Correctional Institution at Graterford, which is in Skippack Township, Pennsylvania, which is Montgomery County, so a little bit north of Philly. Opened in 1929 and closed just a few years ago. It was originally called the New Eastern State Penitentiary. Again, they were getting full, they needed a new prison. So that's that. That's where Bill Cosby served part of his sentence when he was arrested not too long ago. And also Al Capone, probably the most famous inmate. And he's got a great story, but we found his record in the warden's files. And the only reason we knew it was him because we knew what his inmate number was from his mugshot. And then we found that listed in the remarks. So C5527, you know, that's Al Capone. But basically the story was he was arrested in Philadelphia and sent to Eastern State Penitentiary for a while. And when his term was up, they were afraid that either someone would try to shoot him or he'd get mobbed by the press when he's leaving Eastern State Pen. So in the middle of the night before, they whisked him away to Graterford, 30 miles north, and they released him from there. So it's all done under cover of darkness. So with this warden's record, the top portion is from the day he arrived, and it says inmate 5527 arrived. The very next day, 5527 is discharged. So it was kind of a sneaky way of getting them out without the public at large being involved. So kind of a cool story that we find. But again, you've got to look through different types of records to get the full story. The next, and I think this is the last one I have, is the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, which is also known as the State Industrial Home for Women. And this is originally kind of like a reform school. It's for, quote, wayward women or that sort of thing, but it's a women's only prison. So women from all over the state, no matter where you live, where the crime is committed, you can end up at Muncie starting in 1920 or so. And it's still open today. It's still up in, it's kind of close to Williamsport, up in Lycoming County. And they have a really great collection that we got from them of inmate cards. So that's what you're going to see here on the left. So it's going to tell you they're just index cards sometimes that they were writing on, but who the person was, where they came from, what's the crime that was committed allegedly, how long is the sentence. We actually have kind of a complementary set of cards that go with these that are called alias cards. So it says these are all the names that these women may have been known by. So sometimes it's maiden names, sometimes it's nicknames, sometimes it's fake names that they went by, especially for women who escaped from the prison or on the run. So sometimes when you get prison records, not everything is accurate all the time because people, inmates aren't always, it's not in their best interest to be totally honest with all their family information. So sometimes these cards, you'll get different types of stories. You have to corroborate with different things. On the right is an admission notebook we have from there. So again, really interesting stuff, but this is what the records themselves look like when you're doing your records, your research rather. Sometimes it's nice, neat stuff with beautiful handwriting. Sometimes it's an old notebook with stuff written and scratched out, but that's the fun part about doing genealogical research, right? Going through everything, no matter what it looks like. All right, so those are the prisons I want to talk about, not just a couple of other just things that have kind of occurred to me as I've gone through these records. One is, don't be totally surprised if when you find your ancestor, you find they were in multiple different prisons and other institutions. That's very common with the state network. People are moving around a lot, or sometimes people are incarcerated multiple times over the course of their lifetime. And usually that's documented in the records, but that's really just a warning. Look out for references to other prisons and other institutions, because if they're in one place and then they end up somewhere else, we may have records for both of them, and that's how you're going to find the full story. I've got up here on the screen a man, Lewis Henry Ross, who was originally from Pittsburgh. He was a burglar who was known as the Laughing Eel because he was really slippery to catch and he liked to laugh as he was committing his crimes, according to the newspaper report. But originally, when he was 16 or so, he was arrested and he was at that Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory in Huntington. Later, he's released. He commits more crimes, but he's an adult now. First, he's arrested in Minnesota and he serves time at their state penitentiary. And he's back in Pennsylvania. He's arrested again. He shows up at Western State Pen. And then later he's transferred from there to Farview State Hospital, which is an asylum in the northeastern part of the state. So again, one guy is in 4 different institutions, and there's records from each of them, which really fill in the larger story about this man. And just a lot of times you're going to find references like this. And with this guy, it's really just at the bottom, it's a few small lines that just say he was at this other place. And so if you see anything like that, that's a great thread to pull on, and you can learn a lot more about him. But it just means you're going to have to do a little bit more digging around in the records. Another thing is just be prepared for surprises. Again, I was not looking for my family when I was going through the records in Rockfield. I found him. I found one other family member on the other side of the family. You can find skeletons in the closet. You can find things that aren't exciting. I mean, I feel like a horse thief is pretty exciting and neat, but you might find other people who committed crimes which are a little more unsavory. And that's not to say we should feel ashamed of this or anything, but just be prepared for surprises. Be prepared for things that might, be just totally unexpected. So I feel like that's just something, come in prepared to find something you're not looking for, whether it's good or bad or whatever it is, that's how history goes, but just don't go in expecting to find only cool and fun things. You could find anything. That's definitely how the case was for me. All right, so the last thing, and I'm sure this is all, hopefully I've got all your interest. Yes, I want to go to the archives. I want to see these things. I want to learn everything. How do I do that? So we'll talk about that a little bit. The first thing, got it circled so you can't miss it. That's the State Archives website. Everything I'm going to tell you now is all on our website. You can learn all these things there, but I figured I'd cover a little bit here. But really, we've got a couple websites where digitized records are, where we can see them, which is great because you can do it from home. And then also we'll talk about visiting the archives in person, which is my favorite because then I get to see you in the building and we get to talk and I get to show you all the cool stuff that's not on the internet yet. The first thing, it's called the Pennsylvania Power Library, and this is run by the State Library of Pennsylvania. We've got links to it on our website. We are digitizing a lot of our records as fast as we can and putting them up on the Power Library. So it's basically, if you visited us in the past and you saw something on microfilm, odds are we have digitized that and we put it up on this Power Library website. And so this is what the homepage looks like. There's a link on our website which will go to it. And then you would just scroll down to the department that you're looking for, that would be the Pennsylvania Department of Justice. We have 67 different collections of prison records, which are on there. So there's a lot of stuff and you might have to scroll through to find the right one that you're looking for. We're going to have stuff from individual prisons. We have parole records, which are from the state parole board. I think we actually have some like pardon records, which would be from the governor's office. So again, things from our ancestors who were at a particular prison, but their records might be in, like the governor's office papers or something. They're all over, but they're all at the state archives. So this is a great place to start. There's a lot here. It can be overwhelming sometimes, but if you click through, you'll probably find what you're looking for if we've digitized it. Also, we work with Ancestry.com, and we have a fair amount of material, not as much, but we have some stuff that they've scanned. And so if you have a membership or a subscription rather to Ancestry, if you go through the catalog search, the collection is called Pennsylvania Prison Reformatory and Workhouse Records. And so that's all state archive stuff. It's also free to the public since we're all Pennsylvania residents. If you go on the state archives website, there's a page where you just plug in your zip code and then it'll bring you to this page so you can look through everything. And this is nice because it's all text searchable, so you can actually put in an inmate's name and it should spit out all the records from them that they have, because everything is tagged and coded and everything. There's less in here than we have in general, but they do have records from Eastern and Western State Penitentiary, that reformatory in Huntington, remember where all the juvenile offenders are. And they also have some from the Allegheny County Workhouse, which is it's the only county level collection that we have, but we do have some stuff from them. So that's all we have on Ancestry, a great place to do the research if we've got stuff there. And the last thing is visiting us in person. We're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, downtown. Typically, we're open 9 to 4, Wednesday through Friday. Although I don't know if Jonathan has mentioned before, but we are moving this summer. We're getting a brand new building, build up the old one. It's an old building. We don't like it as much. The new one's going to be great and shiny and really nice place to visit. It's going to have parking when you go there, which our old building did not, which is very exciting. The last I heard, we're going to start moving kind of middle of May, and then we'll open up again in the fall. So I know you're all going to rush over to Harrisburg next week to see this stuff, and you can do that this month and next month. But after that, if you're trying to do any of this kind of research, you're going to have to wait till the fall. And I would definitely say, just in general, always call ahead, just say, hey, I want to come over later this week and look at these records. That way we can be ready for you. We can think about other places and other record collections that might help you out that you might not have considered. So you don't have to. We have walk-in, hours for everybody, but it's always great to get in touch with the archivists, just because we've looked through these records so much. We'd love to help you out and kind of tell you a little bit more. I've got up here on the screen our website, our email address for our records department, and their phone number. So if you can't visit in person, we also do remote reference. You can either call or email us. We'd love to scan stuff and send it to you, although there's a fee associated with that. But really, so there's lots of different ways to find all these records. And we're scanning stuff all the time and putting more online, but it's so much that I don't know if we'll ever finish, especially if I keep on bringing more stuff in at the rate I am, but that's how I get my paycheck. So I got to keep finding stuff. And then one last thing just about that, if you're calling or visiting, try and know as much as you can about your ancestor. If you're looking for one particular person before you come, sometimes I find it helps just to have this all written down, or to, if you're emailing the state archives, tell them as much of this as that you know. What's their full name? And that would include any aliases. So if you're looking for women, what are their maiden names? What are anything else like that? When were they born and when did they die? If you know, when were they in the prison? When were they incarcerated? So roughly, if you know when that would have been. A lot of prison records are chronologically listed in the order of people when they were admitted to the prison. So we can't just look in the A box and find Allen or somebody. We're going to have to know if they were admitted in 1872. So we'll look at this page. Where did they live at the time of incarceration? Where was the crime committed? These are just clues that help us find stuff and make sure we're finding the right person in the records. If you know what prison they were at, that's really helpful. If you have an inmate number by any chance, but that's how a lot of things are organized. So again, you're not going to have all this information, but just as much as you have, always have that ahead of time, because that's going to make the searching a lot easier. With that, I will stop talking and listen to questions, but thanks a lot for taking the time to listen, and I hope I've piqued your interest enough to come visit us or come visit our website sometime. Thank you. All right, we've got one question.
Why are some called prisons or workhouses, penitentiaries or hospitals? What's the difference in the designation?
That's a great question. So just for everyone who's online, the question was, why do all these institutions have different names? We've got penitentiaries and prisons and jails and workhouses and reformatories. I don't know the exact answers to that. Typically, it just depends on when the institution was established, because some names are don't know if I'd say more in vogue at different times, but when you're talking about the early 1800s, penitentiary is the word that you see listed for these kinds of institutions, where later today, actually today, all the state prisons are technically called state correctional institutions. So it's really a marker of when the institution itself is founded, and they do change names over time. I don't know the exact difference, but the state level, it's almost always called a prison, and if it's at the county level, it's called jail. And that's really a reflection of just the commitment time. So county jails rather have shorter sentences, and so I don't know the exact definition, but that's why they're called jails, and then state prisons are called prisons. And I think it comes into like what the sentences are for sure.
I think currently, if you're sentenced to less than 2 years, you go to the county facility. If it's more than 2 years, you go to the state, and the idea is the state, you actually can get some vocational training and educational things, whereas at the county level, you get pretty much nothing.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so kind of, we think like, again, none of us are prison experts, but it looks like the breakdown is 2 years. I know originally, so when you have penitentiaries, that actually comes, the idea is like being penitent, like actually reforming them. And there's a lot of great, interesting history, but like with those institutions, before there were state-run prisons, it was really more of like punishments and not jail time. So if you commit a crime, you're going to be, you know, flogged in the town center or something like that. And then with this, the idea is really we're trying to reform people, make them penitent for their crimes so they won't commit another. So again, that's where sometimes the name comes from. Richard.
Question for you.
Yes.
It's my understanding that the Eastern State Penitentiary was originally all confinement. It was all, what do you call it? Solitary confinement. It was actually Charles Dickens. He visited there when he came in 1842. And that's supposed to be the confusion that the inmates would have when they were released, is where from Tale of Two Cities, Dr. Monet, when he got out and didn't know up and down. How long was that solitary confinement?
Good question. So the question for the online folks is, with Eastern State Penitentiary, which was kind of known for it, did they really, basically the inmates were in solitude for their entire sentence? And that was right from the time they were found in the 1820s, I think about the 1860s or so. And so the experience of an inmate at that time would be, you will not see another living person for your entire sentence. So they are in a cell by themselves. When they are outside to go anywhere, they're going to have a bag over their head or a hood. They actually had the guards wear like, I don't know, they put something on their shoes so they wouldn't make noise, so you wouldn't hear anything. Your food comes in a little slot in the door. And they did that basically till the prison population got too large that they just couldn't accommodate that. So they have to do double celling and things like that around the time of the Civil War. But yeah, the idea was, we're going to keep these people in solitude. They will read their Bible and basically do nothing else but reflect upon their life and their crimes and who they are. And when they come out, they will be a better person for it. It didn't work, but that was the idea. And Charles Dickens visited. We actually have his signature in the guest book from Eastern State Pen in the archives, which is really neat. Yeah, he was not a fan of this at all, and he writes about it in his book, American Notes. He visited Western State Penitentiary too, actually. And so, yeah, it was well documented. Lots of people visited this prison. This is really the first of its kind, and they actually called it the Pennsylvania system of imprisonment or incarceration. So yeah, there's lots of books published on this, which I would definitely encourage you to take a look at. It kind of dies out by the 1860s out of necessity, just because you need a lot of work and space to keep somebody in total confinement for a long time, and a prison's only so big. So yeah, again, great, interesting history. I wish I had more time to talk about it here, but definitely encourage you to go look that up. Any other questions on our mind? Nicole?
We have a few online.
Okay, great.
Have you ever come across contracts with businesses who use prison labor?
That's a good question. So prison labor, looking for documents that businesses and corporations that are contracting or working with the prison. Not often. A lot of that is in more recent times, and we don't have as many records from more recent years, just by nature of there's still sometimes active prison records that haven't come to us yet. But I would say if you're looking for that, and if it exists, it's going to be in those financial and administrative records that we do have. A lot of the prisons from me looking at them, they don't really work with outside companies. It's more like each prison is a community unto itself. So you're going to have people who are working the laundry, or you're gonna have people working the wood shop and stuff, and they're gonna sell those things, but it's not necessarily with an outside corporation. That's really like a later 20th century addition to kind of the modern prison system. Jonathan, have you ever seen anything like that in records?
No, but the State Archives has the records of the Boys Industrial Home of Western Pennsylvania. And one of their things was to actually, in a sense, indenture boys out to local farmers and artisans and so forth. And so that's not really contracting with the company, but those are very interesting to see that boys who were thought to be uncontrollable, and so they send them out to work for people, and of course they end up running away and having all other kinds of problems. And those are very interesting records. But because they're juveniles, there's more restrictions on those records, and I'm not sure if you know the details on that or not.
Yeah, well, right now everything in the archives, if it's 75 or more years old, it's open, period, regardless of any other restrictions. But yeah, anything newer, and that's why we always say call ahead. Make sure the collection you want to look at is open. Most prison records are open. But yeah, if there's any work with any corporations, which I just may not be aware of, that's going to be in those financial or administrative records. So definitely encourage you to come in and look for it.
Yeah, I'm chatting here with Sam Dorr, she asked the question, and she thought the financials would reflect.
Yeah,
apparently the Western boys were making harnesses during the Civil War.
Yeah.
But okay. One other quick question. Any medical treatment records or death records, and what did they do with the bodies?
That's a good question. So the question was medical infirmary records or anything, and then also people who died at the prison, what happened to them. It's not going to be every prison and everything, but a lot of medical records will come in. Typically, if it's something major, like a major surgery or major injury, that's going to be written on the inmates, like on their record. So we talked about, like, we have case files, or I think they're called, like, inmate descriptive registers, those sorts of things that will typically talk about it. I showed that one inmate on the screen from Western State Pen who had the nose condition. And so that was actually listed, I think, on his, if I remember correctly, it's been like a year or two since I looked at his admission record, just noted that he had this abscess on his nose. And then his discharge record said that he had surgery while he was at the prison. And then when he was arrested again later, his second admission record and photograph noted that he had had a previous condition and everything. Sometimes, or a lot of times, because you have to think about, why is the prison going to document this thing? They don't just write it because it's something interesting or something. They have to have a reason for doing it. So I think a lot of times with this, it can help identify them later in the future if they escaped, or if there's any other reason why they needed to. So again, something like that, if they have a scar because of something, that's going to be noted. In more recent times, maybe because of the litigation or something like that, they need to know, or they need to know the prison was spending money to have a doctor come in and do something or other. So if something happens, that's why it's going to be documented. So where would they put that information then? It could be in the administrative stuff. It could be in their inmate file. It could be, sometimes we'll have like a doctor's log or an infirmary thing like that. It can be anywhere. Now, for people who died at the institution, that could be hit or miss. That's usually going to be noted in their inmate record, though, which is nice because that's, a significant or unusual event for an inmate. That's what we want. We don't want that to be a common thing in a prison. But typically we'll find it there in there. That's the method of discharge, I guess. You died and left, so you never finished your sentence. Usually the family is going to come and claim the body. And so that's going to be, it's going to say, so-and-so representing the family came and claimed the body and left. Sometimes it'll say where they were buried after that. If that's not the case, if they didn't have any family, or sometimes if they died of some disease that they were worried was contagious, they would bury the body very quickly. That's especially in the 1800s. Some of the prisons had graveyards on the ground. I know Huntingdon does. I'm sure Eastern and Western did at some point. I'm not really sure. You'd have to look up for them. We do have some burial lists, cemetery plot maps, and things like that. Today, sometimes visiting those places can be difficult if it's still an active prison, but you'd have to reach out to the prison itself. I know that's something that some folks have done, but we usually have pretty good documentation if they died on the grounds and are still there. So it's a good question. Always call us and we can help you out to figure it out. Is that the last online question? All right, good questions from the online folks. Anything else on our Jonathan.
I just wanted to mention, Tyler mentioned the Power Library and Ancestry. If you use the Power Library, it's a very bulky system.
Yes.
And you may actually wait 5 minutes for an image to come up, or you might, what normally happens to me is I get started, the first 2 or 3 images come up and then it just gets locked up and you can't see anything. So it's there.
Yeah.
You can petition, beg, plead with the state library to use some other system rather than what they're using because it's horrible. I've actually personally emailed them a couple times saying, you know, I got stuck. How do I get around it? And they can't even do it themselves. So I'm not sure why they don't change the system that they use. But just be aware that if you use the Power Library, it's not the easiest thing to use. The second thing about Ancestry.com, if you use Ancestry and you get results for the same name, but they have different information. If it's the same name, check everything that they bring up because they didn't always correctly associate the name with the information that they put into their index. And so in one case, they might have used a person's intake date to associate with the name. In another case, they might use the person's discharge date, but they may have called them the same type of date. So if the name is the same, I don't care if there's 20 of them, I would open every one of them and take a look at it and see what the record is, because sometimes it'll be the same person because they enter a separate entry for each entry in the record, which means the person was in multiple times or in multiple records, you're going to get multiple hits. And the other thing you have to be careful of too, and this is not just true of prison records, but many records, Ancestry usually only indexes the one side of a document. So if the name is on the one side, but the information continues on the back side of the document, you're not going to pick up. This happens with death certificates all the time. They index the name of the death certificate on the death certificate. And there might be something written on the back, but that they don't index that. So you miss it unless you go to the next image on Ancestry. So I always encourage people when you're looking at something on Ancestry, check the image before and the image after the one that you bring up to see if it's related to the image that you have found, because they don't always index all the information.
Yeah, digital records are by no means perfect, so find a comfy chair before your search starts. Richard.
Just to add to what Jonathan said, he had found probably more than 10 years ago, but found information from the 1830s and 40s for an individual who was at Eastern State. And he found much more than what's on Ancestry. I really want to say it's only like the admissions books that they have on Ancestry. Yeah. So if you find anything on Ancestry, they really want to check with you in the archives, because there's probably a lot more.
Yeah, there's just, people are covered in so many different places, and there's a lot that's not digitized yet. Ancestry and the Power Library, they're a good place to start. But yeah, really, I would never consider that you've got the whole story. There's always going to be something squirreled away somewhere else. Hey, we're all ready to go to the archives, ready to find all of our incarcerated ancestors.
Any other questions for Tyler?
Yeah, I will.
Did you ever take the Eastern State Penitentiary tour?
I did, yes. I've done the tour at Eastern twice now, and it is a lot of fun.
I've never done it. I'd like to hear about it.
It's narrated by the actor Steve Buscemi, which seems strange, but apparently he visited once and had a great time and asked if he could do their audio tour. So I'm going to usually hear him on my headphones, but yeah, it's a great place. The people who work there, they know a lot about Eastern, and not just about the building. Like I think they've indexed all the records that we have and everything. So they have helped a lot of people with genealogy. So, and they also keep on the lookout for, there's always stuff from Eastern State Pen floating around on eBay or wherever else. When the prison closed in the 70s, stuff just scattered to the four winds, and we got most of it, but there's more out there. So they would definitely be another place. If you know you have an ancestor who was there, they can tell you all about what the experience at that time was like. They do a great job. I can't say enough good things about them.
Is it a ghost tour too?
They have, yeah, and I think actually they have like a haunted prison thing in the fall, and that keeps them running the rest of the year. It's that popular. Yeah, it's great. I'd encourage everybody, if you're ever in Philly, go visit them.
And they do have records. Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site does have records that are not at the state archives, and they actually have a larger collection of mug shots at Eastern State Penitentiary than the state archives does.
That's true. Yeah. So again, I know it's harder for your research, but once you find something, just records could be everywhere else. That's why I really encourage you to talk to an archivist. We probably know where the records may be, whether it's in our shop or somewhere else. So we're here to point you in the right direction, but be expected for a few different directions. All right.
Hey, thank you. Let's
Thanks
get
a lot, everyone.
Tyler, yes.